Good afternoon and welcome to this heritage lecture by Professor P. Zachariah. Dr. Zachariah joined CMC in the MBBS batch of 1949 and retired as Professor of Physiology. Thus, Dr. Zach, as he is popularly known, has been connected with CMC for over 70 years. To put that in context for our listeners, Dr. Zachariah was a student in CMC when India became a republic, when CMC got its definitive MBBS recognition. He was here when Dr. Ida Scudder laid the foundation stone for the men's hostel, and in fact, he was the student mess secretary who got the mess started in the new men's hostel. Not only has he witnessed much of the history of our college, he has deep insights into what it can teach us and the eloquence to articulate that for the community. Dr. Zach was a very popular speaker for student retreats and has mentored many of us through our career choices. He continues to touch the lives of thousands of patients in CMC through the PTP fund that he helped to set up. For the alumni who have logged in, Dr. Zach played a decisive role in developing the CMC Alumni Association into the very effective organization it is today. Dr. Zach joined the Department of Physiology in the 1950s at the request of the institution. It was an area of need. He then went on to obtain his DPhil from the University of Oxford and returned to serve in CMC as a faculty member in physiology until his retirement in 1991. His older son, Dr. Anand Zachariah, Professor of Medicine in CMC, has himself pioneered many educational innovations of far-reaching impact. So for over 60 years, except perhaps for a sabbatical year or two, every MBBS alumnus of CMC has been taught the foundational subjects of physiology and medicine by Zachariah. May I welcome Professor P. Zachariah to deliver CMC's fifth heritage lecture entitled Teaching and Learning.
Thank you, Reena. Friends, it is a privilege and almost a miracle for me to be addressing an audience far and wide, something to which I am still getting used to. Greetings to all of you who have made the effort to join this webinar on a Saturday after 12 noon, most of you after a busy week. Some of you are expert in this field, and I appreciate your courtesy in being with us. A special word of welcome to some who are here mainly to walk down the memory lane of their association with Velo and to make contact with one of the few remaining links with their cherished past in CMC. As you will see in the course of this lecture, the opportunity to make these enduring bonds is the reward of a lifetime in education. This is a heritage lecture, and I am in my 90th year. So you may rightly be expecting me to narrate some history. I joined CMC as a student in 1949 with a fairly specific intention of providing healthcare to some unserved community in newly independent India, an expectant India with many promises to keep and many tears to be wiped. And I had a great time during the next 5 years. I was taught by some great teachers like Paul Brand, P. Kutumbaya, Howard Somerville, and J.C. David. We even met some Nobel laureates like Sir Alexander Fleming, the Belgian physiologist Cornel Heymans, and the Danish biochemist Einar Lundsgaard. We also saw the men's hostel coming into being and the men's hostel union being established. And the 5 years went by quickly enough. In those days, we were considered competent to serve suffering humanity once we had satisfied the 54 examiners in the final year exam. But soon after our final year results were announced, Dr. Kutumbaya, the principal, approached me with an unexpected request. He had earlier befriended me during an attack of chickenpox when I had been put away in the isolation cottage in a corner of the hospital campus. At the end of his morning rounds, he would come by himself and spend some time with me discussing books of common interest. And his request would soon lead me to be playing tennis with him in the staff tennis court by the side of the big bungalow. He requested me to help out in the medical college for 1 year as a stopgap teacher in physiology department, which was in dire straits at that time. And I did a lot of teaching to the class of 1954, which included the late Dr. Sarojini Devanandan. Every one of that class I remember fondly. Each day, I tried to explain to them some topic in physiology that I had learned myself the previous night from the textbook of Samson Wright. I found myself gradually caught up in the satisfaction of explaining difficult concepts, say like the mechanics of ventilation, even making up improvised models. I formed a firm bond with that class and perhaps met their expectations. So much so that as the year was ending, Dr. Kutumbaya met me again with an invitation this time to join the permanent faculty of this budding institution, whose core faculty was still mainly expatriate at that time. Perhaps to buy some time, I asked for the experience of clinical for 1 year before making a decision. In the last week of that year of rotating house urgency, I analyzed the two experiences. I found myself strongly drawn to what CMC was trying to become. And I also realized that for me, helping to form young minds came more naturally than any of the branches of clinical medicine I had sampled briefly. And thus, I chose a career in teaching physiology and assisting in CMC's progress. And in that enjoyable journey, I have formed some ideas about such a vocation. It is to pass them on that I agreed to give this lecture. I would like to make it clear that this is a personal articulation of teaching and learning. In my days of physiology teaching, I used to warn my students that my classes aim to teach physiology only as internalized by me, or physiology according to Zachariah, as I called it. So also in this lecture, I will present teaching and learning according to Zachariah. My objective today is to pass on to my audience something of the challenge and the joy of teaching and learning based on my own experience. By teaching, I mean the process of one person trying to pass on to some others some knowledge, be it through a lecture, group presentation, ward clinic, ward rounds, or personal tutorial. As you can see, in the field of medicine, this kind of learning and teaching occurs all the time and at every level. The institution which formed me and in which I formed my ideas of teaching has two core values which is relevant to our discussion. Firstly, social responsibility. Secondly, the idea of community affirming personal relationships. These two will be behind the curtains as I speak today, but will emerge towards the end of my talk. Is teaching a dying art? I realize that with the advent of digital technology, aided by the online teaching due to COVID, there may be a growing feeling that teaching is increasingly irrelevant. Let me just say that digital technology actually allows us or even forces us to focus on the true tasks of the teacher. Equally, it aids the student becoming much more of a true learner. Also, there is no profession other than medicine where the Guru Shishya Parampara or the direct transmission from one to the other is so intrinsic to professional development. So I have chosen the topic teaching and learning not as a requiem or elegy for the dying art by an aging practitioner, but rather to affirm the possibilities of an ancient art in the 21st century. Let us look in some detail at why medical education is quite a challenge, perhaps more than in many other professions. Medical education has an extraordinary fascination in the public imagination. But the public concern is about admission into it and the immense cost of it, rather than about the process itself. To the extent they think about the process of medical education, it is recognized to be more arduous and demanding than almost any other professional education. During the MBBS course, there are a large and increasing number of subjects to be mastered, each of them with a fair degree of thoroughness. And as the course proceeds, the emphasis shifts from knowledge to competency in performance. But in all of them, there are three or more specific challenges. The first is the sheer volume of material to be studied. Even 70 years ago, when I was an undergraduate, the first two textbooks that you encountered in the first year were Gray's Textbook of Anatomy and a Textbook of Physiology by Beston Taylor, both perhaps among the heaviest books in the medical library. Secondly, the detail in which you are required to know every topic. It is not enough to understand the phenomenon of excitation-contraction coupling, for example. You have to know the varieties of calcium channels, their distribution, and the drugs can modulate each type of calcium channel. The third challenge is of retaining this volume in detail for ready recall. And finally, there is a challenge of integration and application of all this knowledge, without which all the rest is futile. When you are at the bedside of the patient with intractable hypertension, you need to apply your knowledge of calcium channel blockers towards solving the patient's problem, also remembering the multiple other factors which affect blood pressure and which also can be modulated to lower the blood pressure. Add to this the problem of redundancy. How, with the rapid advances in knowledge, what you have just learned becomes out of date almost on a yearly basis. The challenge for the teacher and the undergraduate pupil is how do we ascend this Mount Everest with some degree of success and without feeling overwhelmed. But the digital revolution can come to our help in some of these challenges. And their application has been promoted by the COVID pandemic. I refer to these benefits of digital revolution as 3 A's. Firstly, the availability. Today, wherever you may be, and without any limitations due to cost or social factors, there is available to you educational material on any subject at any level of knowledge, from that of a first-year student to that of the expert interventionist radiologist. The only limit is your inquisitiveness and the availability of time. The second A is access. In an instant, whether in your study, in the clinic, or at the bedside. This greatly reduces the problems of volume, detail, and limitations of memory that I mentioned earlier. The third A is audiovisual aids of communication. With the ready availability of graphics, animations, videos, and virtual reality, the spoken and the written word now readily comes to life. Now I would like to move on to the essentials of preparing a lesson. In my experience, the first requirement is that the teacher must begin with a clear idea of what he needs to convey. In this, teaching is no different from preaching. In many church traditions, the church provides a list of Bible readings around some selected topic for each week. And the preacher's task is to extract from these texts a few, usually 3, takeaway points, and then work out the best way to convey these 3 points convincingly and attractively and not exceeding 20 or 25 minutes. And if he is successful, he would create in his hearers an eagerness to explore what they are taking away by further reading, reflection, or application in the daily life of the coming week. So also, before you structure your teaching session, however complicated or voluminous the topic to be addressed is, you must form in your mind the limited number of points without which the topic cannot be understood and with which you would have grasped the essentials. Thus, the first step in achieving a sound teaching session is that the preacher must undertake a brief relearning session. This is no less elaborate than converting milk proteins into plasma proteins. You have to break down the dietary protein into amino acids and absorb them, modify some of them in the liver, reassemble them into human plasma proteins, and deliver them into the systemic circulation. I used to do this for every lecture, even in my 30th year of teaching career, taking about 2 hours in my later years. I never kept my lecture notes, but made them afresh for each class. This reassembly of the same material made it challenging for me and fresh for the students. It is like how a violinist prepares for a concert performance. You first tune the strings, and then you practice the piece alone, and then in company, every time reinterpreting what is set before you in the composer's score and delivering it as a new experience for the hearers. All these have some implications for those who assign teaching responsibilities, especially in a setting where the teachers have many other responsibilities. Lecture preparations take time, especially for the beginners, and they must be relieved from their other responsibilities with sufficient time to prepare. In preparing like this, there are some guidelines. Firstly, your objective is not to be comprehensive like a textbook. It is not your intention that if a student takes thorough notes of your lecture, then he need not read the textbook. There is always more can be covered in your teaching. For instance, if you are taking a set of lectures on blood for the first year students, you probably will have only one lecture on coagulation. If that is all the time you have to decide what are the limited essential points you need to get across. Secondly, it involves also deciding all you can leave out for the student to learn by himself once these essentials have been grasped. Thirdly, in your selection, you keep in mind that you have to evoke the student's interest through some anecdote, some association with history or contemporary events or an analogy, and also his curiosity by some tantalizing cue. Fourthly, you also identify some material on the internet or other than the textbooks, which you can recommend for the student to fill in the gaps or enlarge the envelope of his understanding. Having settled on the building blocks, you are now ready to build the edifice of one or more ideas that you want to convey in your teaching sessions. You assemble the information that you began with into a bundle of knowledge such that they fit into patterns the student can recognize, and also such that this will fit into patterns that he will be learning later. And thus, these are not isolated pieces to be learned, but parts of an emerging body of principles, an additional pillar or arch or cornerstone in an ever-expanding conceptual framework. Thus, your lecture on coagulation is not a description of 13 coagulation factors, but it will build ideas. The ideas of precursors which need to be activated, a cascade of serial activating reactions, the possibility of amplification through a cascade, the possibility of positive feedback in such a cascade, the idea of a physiological equilibrium being achieved balancing two opposing tendencies of coagulation and anticoagulation, and so on. You will outline the ingenious idea of tubes which automatically shut down when there is a leak. The idea of a fluid that automatically solidifies when there is a leak. A fluid that cleverly carries within it elements which can solidify when triggered to do so. Also making sure that the trigger is sufficiently complicated to avoid going off by accident. Thus, the concept of a series of keys which have to be turned in a particular order, each key with a different stakeholder, like the multiple officers for the safety lockers in the banks. Also, the idea of having multiple parallel pathways so that if one fails, another will surely ensure safety. The concept of redundancy. Thus, you lay out the coagulation factors and show how the dots can be connected to get the desired fascinating picture. The title of the next paragraph is gift wrapping. Having clarified in your own mind how this bundle of ideas is to be presented, you package it in a wrapping paper intended to make it interesting. For instance, you may begin your lecture on coagulation with an account of a hemophilic bleeding or a coronary thrombosis, or perhaps a story of how European history was influenced by the inheritance of hemophilia. When we were medical students, there was a month-long orientation course at the beginning of the first clinical year. This was usually taken by Dr. J.S. Carmen, the senior-most professor in surgery. The administration building in CMC College campus is named after him. He liked to pass on some aphorisms to us. And one of these was, seize the moment of intellectual curiosity for the acquisition of knowledge. Thus, if the topic is introduced as a problem to be solved, a question to be answered, we could create the moment of intellectual curiosity for acquisition of the knowledge at hand. But there is one kind of packaging that I would specially recommend. Whatever the topic, there is often the opportunity to bring in societal dimension. You may be talking of anemia or hypoproteinemia, but do not forget to highlight the unacceptable levels of stunting among India's children. You may be dealing with blood pressure, as occurs at many points in a medical course. But let the students grow up conscious of how vascular diseases account for much of the morbidity and mortality in a population, and how, in fact, this is a lifestyle issue. In this outline of teaching, it is no less complicated than the stages of labor in obstetrics, as much mixed with preparation, with painful effort, and the end result of joy. Let me spell out or even celebrate the end result of fulfillment in the life of a basic science teacher. It is in facilitating an epiphany for your pupils. In the Christian tradition, epiphany is associated with the Christmas story of the Magi, or the so-called wise men from the East. They had traveled far, expecting to see a royal prince who was destined to be a king. But they end up in a cowshed and find there a baby in swaddling clothes. But in that surprising moment, they discover that the hopes and fears of all the years were to be fulfilled in this helpless baby lying on a pad of straws. No wonder they went back by a route different from the one they had come by, because they had become enlightened, because they had understood something fundamental and new. The teacher's labor is in the pangs of delivering such an epiphany. It is said the teacher should be exhausted and the student exhilarated. The teacher's reward is when the student says, aha, I have got it. Let me give you one example. One of the innovations I helped to initiate in CMC was the idea of a short course or a module called Learning to Learn at the very beginning of medical studies. Our effort was to help them to see what true learning is. We asked the students to identify an object from a series of descriptive clues. We then described to them individual parts of a cycle, giving them verbal pictures of each component of a cycle: the hollow tubes of the frame, the rubber tubes, the circular wheels, the toothed crank and flywheels, and so on. For some time, the students tried to grasp these individual details without seeing the whole. But there comes a moment when one student says, "Of course, this is a bicycle." This is what we call the aha moment, the moment of epiphany, the moment of true learning. A CMC alumnus from the 1970s, who is now on the faculty of one of the most prestigious medical schools, put it thus: "It was in these classes that I first became fascinated by the inner workings of the human body, the carefully worded expositions of the underlying logic of the cardiac cycle, of nerve conduction, of the feedback loops that controlled endocrine function were beautiful revelations." The emphasis was on the principles rather than details, explaining that finer points could always be picked up later once the conceptual framework had been understood. Listening to such lectures was like peeling back the skin and gazing wonderstruck at the smoothly running machinery beneath. They left you eager to dig deeper, to learn as much as you possibly could. But to scatter the seeds of such learning, the ground has to be prepared. It so happened that earlier this week, I attended on Zoom the graduation function of my school-leaving grandson. Among the many expressions of thanks to the teachers, one girl said, "You taught us not so much what to learn as how to learn." Unfortunately, most schools in our country tend to function on the opposite principle. This is made worse by the way our all-important examinations are conducted, whether for entry into courses or for graduating from them. And thus, we produce graduates who are experts in passing examinations, but weak in situational performance. Today, I know the first year students do have a module aimed at learning to learn, but I believe this theme should be worked out throughout the course, and teachers must share with one another ways they find to promote this. Now, let me touch briefly upon the place of audiovisual aids. Earlier, I referred to these as one of the boons of digital revolution. For almost any topic of your choice, you can today easily find many graphics and even videos which could embellish your spoken words. Today, even lawyers seek the permission of the judges to use them in their pleadings. But no lawyer will win his case if he cannot make a convincing verbal pleading. So also, a good lecture is based on the conceptual framework, the anecdotes, the aphorisms that you have carefully prepared. You must prepare these such that the lecture will work even if the electricity failed. Pickings from the internet should not be a substitute for careful conceptualization. If so, you may well find that you have to make your own visuals which illustrates the mental picture precisely in the way you conceived it. After all, if the thrust of your presentation is what you have picked up from the internet, why not just circulate the list of the links and let the students benefit from it at their convenience? The pandemic has transferred much of education to offline teaching. Once a lecture is on Zoom, you might as well record it and make it available on YouTube. If so, in many cases, you may find that there are equally good or better presentations available on YouTube. If so, why not just give the links of a lecture? My point is that in the days to come, the thrust of in-person teaching is the dynamics of the physical interaction in the class. If so, the use of other aids should be judicious, should never come in the way of that dynamic. One must use them as a supplement to the lecture and not as a virtual substitute. It is also very important to realize that an elaborate table or a complicated schema on a printed page can be studied with all the required time. But when that is projected during a lecture, time and attention may be quite inadequate to take it in fully. But most of the time, the visuals are copied from the publications meant for perusal in one study. Tables and tabulations, when projected, should have as few lines and columns as possible. Diagrams should again be relatively simple. Visuals should enrich your presentation and not overwhelm it. I take some time to spell these out because the ease of PowerPoint and of cut and paste and of handing out their printouts has become the black fungus or the mucormycosis of lectures today. Let us move on to the place of experiments in teaching methods. I mentioned earlier that I enjoyed the challenge of preparing a fresh lecture for each new batch. So also I believe that it is refreshing to experiment with different methods of teaching. Today, courses in educational methodology have become mandatory for medical faculty, and experimentation in these methods has become popular. My own feeling is that it is not easy to give rigorous evidence for the validity or superiority of newer methods over earlier ones. But irrespective of that, newer methods should be tried selectively, provided they are based on sound educational principles. And irrespective of their superiority or otherwise, their newness induces both the teacher and the students with beneficial results. Thus, in the 1960s and even up to 1990, I have given students the benefit of methods like self-study, personal tutorials, problem-based learning, integrated learning, and so on. I think that every teacher must make a New Year resolution to try out some little innovation or modification in his teaching during the year. And each batch should have the benefit of one novel teaching method. You will find yourself a better teacher, and many of your students may remember you at least for that novel experience. My next point is that there is potential for teaching and learning in all healthcare situations. I would like to think that my audience would include medical professionals who are not directly involved in medical education. More broadly, I would like to address all health professionals, irrespective of whether they have academic functions or not. All healthcare involves working in teams, and the teams would include physicians at different levels of their professional development, as also other health professionals in nursing, therapy, lab technology, and so on, and at different levels of experience and information. In each group, there is opportunity for dissemination of knowledge and skills upwards and downwards. And certainly each profession can fertilize the others. Thus, it is my belief that the entire field of healthcare is rife with opportunities for fertilization from each other. Every day, every one of us is going to school in one sense or another. We are all potential donors or recipients to one another in our desire to keep developing, more than the acquisition of educational skills. What is required is an attitude of universal, collective, and never-ending flow of competence within the field of healthcare. Especially in our country, for a long time to come, each of us may have to function in overlapping roles in order to take our country towards universal healthcare. During the COVID pandemic, we have seen the boundaries disappear and the silos coming down. Like a village health worker being a greater expert in communication of COVID messages than those who sit in high councils and are baffled by vaccination hesitancy. Thus, if we are truly interested in learning from one another or in enhancing the armamentarium of all of us together, this discussion of learning and teaching may have relevance to all of us. I would now like to move from conceptual systems to conceptual thinking. I have labored the thought that our object is not to pass on bundles of information, but to convey concepts around particular phenomena. From the coagulation of blood, you may take the student to the flow of blood. Here you deal with a rhythmic pump with its own switching device. It beats intermittently but produces continuous flow. Now, this is a new set of concepts. You proceed in this way towards a fuller and fuller understanding of Claude Bernard's all-embracing concept of homeostasis. And you end up with a student who has acquired the habit of seeking for patterns and explanations, and also finding them and assembling them into ever-enlarging conceptual frameworks. And the end result is a health professional who thinks critically and scientifically through old and newer problems, but also is able to grasp emerging areas of knowledge and therapy. This is not unlike helping your children with jigsaw puzzles. You introduce them to the first few simple puzzles. They pick up the thought process and want to do larger and larger demanding puzzles. Meanwhile, Rubik's Cube has been invented. You struggle with it as a parent, and then you help your child with three-dimensional thinking, a quantum jump in puzzle solving. You think your job is now done. But now by herself, your daughter cracks a hexagonal Rubik's Cube and then cubes with 9 sides and more. She has developed a mind which seeks and finds patterns and ever more interrelated patterns in areas of knowledge of her choice. This leads me to something which has been even more important to me than all that I have said so far. Indeed, what I would call the nectar of a career in teaching. Over the years, I have come to the conclusion that if you think of your life as an investment opportunity, the best way you can invest your life is in the advancement of person. Most of the things that we do, however important they may be at that time, are transitory. They serve their purpose and pass behind the curtain of time. But when you help to build a person, you start something which goes on beyond your time and beyond her time, because it can be passed on from one person to another and thus has the possibility of continuity. Not only does it continue, but it also multiplies with each passage like the coagulation cascade. Thus, the envelope of your influence keep expanding in numbers and enduring in time. Your aim is to invest in the development of socially responsible and concerned human beings who are able to navigate life's perplexing sea. This means that you take an interest in your pupils, just as they are, beyond being receptacles of medical education. You are alert for such occasions to come in contact with them, and young people seldom fail to respond. Let me give a small example. In CMC, in the early days after the first year students are admitted, the community in the college campus welcomes them at a small social occasion when each student is briefly introduced. Soon after one such occasion, I happened to pass by a fresher student in the campus, and she said good evening out of courtesy. And I responded, calling her by her first name. And some 40 years later, she still remembers this small act of personal affirmation as the beginning of a warm association. As the lives of your students unfold among diverse avenues, during the long period of education as undergraduates and postgraduates, you watch and affirm them with joy. You promote every activity which furthers their development beyond the curriculum in individual, small group, and corporate settings. You look out for celebratory or sometimes sorrowful occasions which you can share with them. Sometimes you may hold the hand of a first-year student who just wants to abandon medical education for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes you are able to help them over a particular stumbling block. Perhaps you play a small role in the choice of their careers or in opening some door in their chosen path. And you end up with relationships that endure over time and warm your heart beyond all the teaching and learning. And you can feel confident that when you give a lecture in your 90th year, there will, in some far off places, be those who attend it just to connect with Dr. Zach. Of course, CMC was built on this principle, and its faculty has a special opportunity and a special responsibility to practice it. But I believe that every teacher and every educational institution can practice it according to their circumstances and find great fulfillment. Friends, we have traveled a long way. We have taken some diversions, and I may have lost many of you along the way. But as I close, let me try to say in one paragraph my takeaway message for you. Firstly, I have wanted to share with you the joy and fulfillment of making teaching an important part or even the major part of your medical career. Secondly, though the medical science deals with vast amounts of information, the primary task of the teacher is to elucidate the concepts which hold the facts together and eventually to endow the student with the proficiency to do this for himself for any branch of knowledge. I dwelt at some length on the do's and don'ts towards this. Thirdly, that beyond the knowledgeability of the student, a teacher's goal is the formation of the mind of the student. Not merely the mind, but the personhood of the student as a healer and as a human being. Thus, your teaching career enlarges into a life of investment in the advancement of others. And when you relate to your students at that deep level, the joy of teaching broadens into enduring relationships and your fulfillment is complete. I have also tried to suggest that all this is not just for career teachers or just for physicians, but that in the teams within which we all work, there is much scope for this kind of mutual enrichment, this kind of investment in one another for everyone, irrespective of rank or seniority. For me, there is a bitter sweetness in this moment. My 90th birthday is just a few weeks away, and it is hardly like that I may speak in this way again. And if these are to be my parting words on the leitmotif of my working life, I hope that they have the ring of authenticity rather than rhetoric or nostalgia. We live in times which forces us to think along new ways. My hope is that I have invited you to think afresh on teaching and learning, not just in medicine, but in life's pilgrimage. I'm grateful to the Department of Continuing Medical Education and to its head, Dr. Reena George, for this opportunity. And I wish particular success to the Heritage Lectures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for that wise and wonderful lecture. I'm just thinking, for the last 30 years, we have missed you as a teacher. You're going to be 90. Two things that struck me was, what you very rightly highlighted about less is more. And a teacher's job is not to cover the syllabus, but to uncover the beauty and the patterns that are waiting to be discovered. I'm sure Dr. Zach would be happy to take questions. I will start with a few that have already been sent in, and please feel free to type in your questions into the chat box. How do you ensure and guide free thinking and creativity in the student?
We must first acknowledge that the degree of creativity to some extent is inborn, and some people are born more creative than others. But you would have noticed that my lecture itself was emphasizing that every time you try to show a creative way of looking at what is in the textbook. And in your presentation, again, you can present alternative views so that one thing is not the gospel truth. It is also possible to show the evolution of ideas to the present knowledge in various areas. Now, all this helps the student also to think creatively. One of my compatriots for the DPhil in Oxford was Gordon M. Shepherd. He is today probably the doyen of neurophysiology in America. Now, he was asked, what are the secrets of a successful scientist? And he mentioned 4 things, including creativity. He said, firstly, passion. But when you are passionate, you may lose your objectivity. So the second requirement is intellectual integrity. And he put, thirdly, creativity. But he went on to add that creativity will not succeed without perseverance. That Edison had to take 1,000 filaments before he got the incandescent. So creativity, thinking in abstraction and saying we should cultivate in students may not get us very far.
Another question is, what are the relevance of your observations on current UG and PG teaching? You have already touched on that, but would you like to add anything more?
Well, my hope is that every health professional, for the reasons that I have explained, will think of the options of being a teacher, not necessarily the role of a teacher, but in the process of dissemination, both ways, learning. So if for the young people who are listening, especially in the medical field, you may not be working in a teaching institution in your career, but always, wherever you are, you will be working with a team. And if you are alert to the possibility that always you can help someone else in the team, and also that you can learn from them, that may be the way to increase the efficacy of our term as also our own personal growth. I also perhaps want to emphasize what I said about digital technology, all its advantages, but I say again that I see more often its misuse. And therefore, young people especially, I would urge them first try to make a lecture without those slides, and then decide what are the few illustrations which might best help.
What about the flipped classroom? Because, often the younger generation can access information even more easily than the teacher. So if the information is given and the classroom is a space for interaction and clarification in this digital age, what do you think about the potential of that?
Certainly, you can interact within the class, but I also think that always what a lecturer has to convey will fit in a prepared ground. In other words, if each student comes to the class with some idea of what the lecture is about, and perhaps the main facets of it, so that when the teacher picks it up, it fits into slots which have already been prepared. Now, very often, I don't think there are textbook materials suitable for that kind of preparation by the student. But today with digital technology, you can easily pass out a one-sheet information sheet where you mention what the next lecture will be about and setting the background so that when actually the text is given, it readily fits it.
It's a wonderful suggestion, actually, which could help our students very immediately. There's a question from Dr. Ramji Narayan. In summary, would you think it's better the student goes through a basic textbook first rather than plunge into multiple sources for fear of getting, of missing the wood for the trees?
Well, of course, when you are a teacher, one of the awkward questions you're asked is, which is the best textbook? And of course, there is no best textbook. Now, I mentioned that when I started teaching, Samson Wright fitted me. And in fact, much of my teaching I modeled on Samson Wright. But at that time, the famous book was Beston Taylor. So each student has to find the book that suits him and not worry about all the books. Because again, as I said today, the lecturer can pass on a few selected internet sources, which will supplement whatever he may read in the textbook.
We have had a number of appreciative comments. people remembering their inspirational classes with you. You have been compared with the eloquence of Shashi Tharoor. Another question that has come up is, competency-based medical education is coming in a big way. What are your thoughts about that?
My thoughts are mixed. First of all, I think that the terminology is wrong. We all know what we mean when you say problem-based education. It means that problems are the only way that whole course is structured. In McMaster University, in the 3.5 years of the bachelor course, there's nothing other than 40 problems, full stop. There's no anatomy, physiology, surgery, medicine, nothing. They just work their way through 40 problems in small groups. So that terminology is right because the curriculum is based on problem. But when you say competency-based, what do you mean? Are you going to run the course on certain specified competencies? So I think the terminology indicates a certain confusion. Secondly, if you look at the 2015 vision statement of the MCI as to the main competencies to be learned, there are 5: clinician, leadership role, communication, lifelong learner, professionalism. And under clinician, it repeats preventive, promotive, curative, palliative, holistic. It simply lists all that you would like your doctor to be, and especially emphasizes some things which are missed, like, the WHO definition is of what is healthcare and so on. Now, of course, a student should be a lifelong learner, but would you think of it as competency to be learned? Just like, you would like your student to be creative and professionalism. Now, how does professionalism become a competency? Well, it is a list trying to emphasize some things which people think. Now, if your objective is to improve the course, why not just call a new course and put in the things that need to be done rather than say it is competency-based? So I have difficulties with the term. I have difficulties also with the origins of this idea. I think this terminology arose in developed countries who depend heavily on medical graduates from underdeveloped countries. And they found that these students do very well in easy FMG. You recruit them, but then on the ground, they don't make good housemen or registrars. So they would like to get a more refined product which suits their thing. So to some extent, it is a north-south question to help South to produce graduates which will satisfy the North. So what I would like to say is that certainly there is probably a deficiency of competency, but then we should remember the history of medical education. Originally, it was apprenticeship. So what you learn there? Mainly skills by imitating the other. Or in other words, it was totally competency-based. It was Flexner who broadened the base and initiated structured learning places. See, one of the beauties of medical education is that most of the course you actually study in the field where healthcare is being provided. Now, a law student does not learn most of the law sitting in a court, nor does an engineer learn most of engineering working at a bridge. But in medicine, we have the unique possibility of having most of your education where the action is. And the competency-based program came out of the realization that this is not working. So what we have to do, I think, is to make fully avail of the possibilities of clinical education occurring in practical situations. Certainly, it is a good idea to spell out what competency they should acquire at the first year, second year, final year, and so on. So maybe there is a need for structuring competency tests and defining them at different level. But to think that this is a new kind of education like problem-based education which will solve our problems, I have difficulties with that.
Yes. We have a question from Amrit, who is a first-year student in CMC. And Amrit has asked, how could I focus more on learning rather than competing?
One of the great things about CMC is that we don't just give prizes for 1, 2, 3. Even on graduation day, we recognize at least 10% of the students, usually. We give 6 ranks, we used to give it for a class of 60. In other words, we are not saying that some people just have all the information, others don't have. It is an atmosphere. The students come from diverse backgrounds, many of them with language difficulties or have not gone to good schools and so on. So it is recognized, but I would say one thing. I have watched the ranks of students at the time of admission who all got A's. And I have looked the ranks, the first 10% when they pass out. Not all A's or not even most of the A's get in that rank. In other words, in the course of the education, everybody has an opportunity to blossom, but I think it is up to the teachers and the environment to give the student the self-confidence that you are all right as you are, and give them the joy of mastering such things as he has and increase his confidence. But as I say, those who come with great credentials do not necessarily make the best graduates.
Thank you, sir. We are privileged to have Dr. Janet Grant logging in, and thank you. And she has said that competency-based education has troubled her for more than 2 decades, and she was happy to hear your perspective on it, sir. I just wanted to conclude by asking if you might share an anecdote or a story of either a teacher or a student who has left a lasting impression on you or inspired you.
The story I am going to tell you touches the very end of my lecture, that our objective is actually the person who can traverse the sea of our life in a socially oriented way. Now, I had a classmate who came from Bangladesh originally, had already graduated, and so he actually was the oldest in the class. And he had great problem with passing examinations. And he took quite a long time, so that I was embarrassed. When I was on the faculty, he was still trying to finish his MBBS. But after graduation, he worked in a small mission hospital where he learned that for mission hospital, surgery is important. So he went back and got MS in surgery and went to the farthermost corner of India, Tezpur. He took up an hospital there, spent all his life there. And he was an inspiration to all of us in the class. He got a Paul Harrison Award. And actually, towards the end of his life, he came back here and he passed away here and buried in Bangalore. Now, what a magnificent life, even though not an academic life. So this is why I emphasize towards the end result is a knowledgeable, good person.
Thank you, sir. I think your classmate's daughter was my classmate, and let us end by just acknowledging how fortunate we are to belong to this heritage of teaching and learning. Thank you all for joining in from across the world, and have a good weekend. Thank you.